After you mark that song, take out a Bible and turn to 1 Samuel 17. 1 Samuel 17. First Samuel 17. Thanks so much for coming out this evening. It's been a good, we had a good start to our meeting, I think, yesterday, and I'm excited about the rest of the week. It's just really good to see you this evening. I was at dinner. Jason said in one of your classes, y'all been doing 1 Samuel. There was some concern, is this going to be fresh or going to be some overlap? But he reassured me very strongly that he taught it in such a way that you all will have forgotten it by now in 1 Samuel 17. So thank you, Jason. One of the greatest gifts we can give our kids is a good foundation of Bible knowledge. If we want them to grow up to know the God who made us, if we want them to grow up in the world which God made and told us how to get along best in, then the Bible is where we need to go. And a natural entry point for children to the Bible are the wonderful stories found in it. And a skilled teacher can engross even very young children in the stories of Adam and Eve, or Noah's Ark, or Jonah, and then draw out some very basic but absolutely necessary lessons about God and serving Him. But recently I began to worry that because we so associate many of these stories with childhood, that we think they are merely children's stories. That we think there are some things in the Bible that we have mastered and outgrown. So back home in Mount Pleasant, at the beginning of this year, I started preaching once a month on a lot of these familiar Bible stories, but revisiting them with a more mature appreciation for the very grown-up truths at the core of them. And I call the series More Than a Children's Story, and the rest of our lesson is going to be taken from that. I want to say I'm on board with teaching these to our kids. We've got to do that. But what I'm saying in this series is we haven't plumbed the depths of these stories if we think that a 5-year-old can master them. And so today I want us to think about the story of David and Goliath. Now from the beginning, sometimes the giveaway that the children's story hasn't captured the essence is simply from what we call it. So for instance, when I preached on Jonah and the whale, I want to call it, but some of you are going to have a problem, Jonah and the big fish, there you go. I realized that while that big fish is the thing that captures our imagination, and so naturally it works itself up into what we call it, if you read the text and take it for what it's saying, the fish is really a minor character in the story and really is beside the point. Jonah is a book about a prophet of God with a heart full of hate. And I think similarly, calling the story David and Goliath also fails to capture the real dynamics at work in the story. The showdown between David and Goliath is an important part of the story, but it is not the only, or I'm going to argue even the main showdown in the story. And so how I like to break down the text and think about it is to bring out all the different verses, all the different contrasts throughout the story, beginning with this one. This is the first contrast in the story, and that is Saul versus Goliath. So 1 Samuel 17 and verse 1 puts the army of the Philistines and the army of Israel led by Saul together in a valley. Now, the Philistines are a constant enemy of Israel throughout this era of their history. They are, for example, the people Samson was fighting against and seeking to loosen the grip of Philistia on Israel. And now the battle lines have been drawn in what seems to be a decisive battle. But this is no ordinary battle with army against army. Rather, it will be a one-on-one showdown. Philistia's greatest warrior against Israel's greatest warrior, winner take all. And actually, I'm told this was not at all uncommon in the ancient Near East for armies to come to some sort of agreement like this, that this is an honorable outcome. Our greatest warrior versus yours, winner take all. Now, we'll see that Philistia is eager for this arrangement because they think they have an unbeatable champion. Israel agrees to this challenge as well, puzzlingly, perhaps, if Goliath is the guy you have to go up against. But I think it is probably because they think they have a better chance one-on-one than they do army against army. It is the sort of calculation you start doing when you no longer trust that God will deliver you, which is a major problem. And so we'll pick up in verse 4 of the text, 1 Samuel 17 and verse 4. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of his coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." So Goliath is 9'6" tall. His armor weighs 126 pounds. The head of his spear alone weighs 16 pounds. The point is pretty easy to understand. Goliath is big and bad, and he knows it. And he throws down the gauntlet in verse 10. And the Philistines said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." Verse 11 says, "When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistines, they were dismayed and greatly afraid." This opening paragraph has really been leading up to Saul's reaction in verse 11. Previous to this in 1 Samuel, what is Saul always known for, appearance-wise? What do we always think of when we think of Saul? Saul, previous to this in the book of 1 Samuel, is always the big man. He is always the impressive-looking man. 1 Samuel 9:2, from his shoulders upwards he was taller than any of the people. Remember, the reason Israel wanted a king in the first place was to lead them in battle against the Philistines. Again, they couldn't trust that God would deliver them. They needed a man like the Gentile nations had. And God hesitantly said, "Okay, I'll give you a king. I'll go ahead and even give you your Platonic ideal of a king, someone handsome and tall and impressive looking." But we quickly find, while Saul has the appearance of a warrior, he doesn't have the courage of one. Israel wanted a king to lead them in battle, and this is what they get for their money, a king who's cowering behind his own men. Now, at this point as well, attentive readers of 1 Samuel will remember that this is not the first time in our Bible when Israel has been scared by Canaanite giants. Do you remember the story? Numbers 13. The spies go into Canaan. 10 of them come back talking about giants in the land. They say, "And we seemed ourselves like grasshoppers." And we know from that story that such fear was a result of faithlessness, that they didn't trust that it wasn't up to Israel's size and strength to conquer Canaan. What the faithless spies didn't understand, and what Joshua and Caleb did understand, was that the victory was a simple matter of trusting that God would do what he had promised. That was the only thing that mattered. That's the only factor you need to calculate your chances of winning. Their task was simply to march forward in faith. That's what Joshua and Caleb knew, and that's what the 10 faithful spies did not know. So who is Saul more like here as he's confronted with the Canaanite giant? Is he like Joshua, or is he like the other 10? Saul is clearly like the faithless spies, completely evaluating the situation based on his smallness and Goliath's bigness. Faith in God's promises play no part in his evaluation of the situation. Verse 11 is the point of this opening contrast, and it is a severe denunciation of Saul's faith. It's not just that he's scared, though he is that. It's the reason he's scared, and that is he just doesn't believe God. And so that's the first showdown, Saul versus Goliath, victory Goliath. Number 2 is the contrast between David and Saul. So we're introduced to David in verse 12. And when David is introduced in the story, what is emphasized about him really are his youth and his lack of military credentials. So the first role we're introduced as David as having in this section is David as a son. David as a son, that's verse 12. Now David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah named Jesse, who had 8 sons. In the days of Saul, the man was already old and advanced in years. Interpreters point out that David is not called a man anywhere in this chapter. All he is in verse 12 is the son of a man. Jesse is the only man in verse 12. David is a boy, the youngest of 8 sons, not to mention. And so David is a mere son in verse 12. In verse 13, David is a little brother. That's what he is. Verse 13, the 3 oldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul to the battle, and the names of the 3 sons who went to battle were Eliab, the firstborn, next to him Abinadab, and the third Shema. David was the youngest. The 3 eldest followed Saul. The point is, David has the least amount of clout even in his own family. He is the youngest son in a culture that affords all privileges and respect to the oldest son. 3 of Jesse's sons are in Saul's army, not David. By the way, we can be almost certain David is younger than 20. That's how old you had to be to serve in Israel's army. So David is a son, David is a little brother, and in verse 15, David is a shepherd. Verse 15, but David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. So David doesn't serve in the army like his brothers. He's a lowly shepherd. And verse 15 also says, not even of his own sheep. Just a little more sort of indignity to it. Not even of his own sheep. He's still under his father's roof, tending his father's sheep. David, the son, the little brother, the shepherd. And then in verse 17, David, the errand boy. That's what he is in verse 17. Jesse said to David, his son, take for your brothers an ephah of parched grain and these 10 loaves, and carry them quickly to the camp of your brothers. Also take these 10 cheeses to the commander of their 1,000. See if your brothers are well, and bring some token from them. Well, David finally gets to do something kind of sort of in the army, but the only service he's deemed worthy of is being the errand boy, bringing rations to his brothers in the battlefield. But while this errand boy is on one of these errands for his father, he comes to the field of battle and he overhears Goliath's taunts. Verse 23 now, 23. As he talked with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before, and David heard him. Now, little does Goliath know, he has just taunted one time too many. In verses 24 and 25, there is the army of Israel cowering once again at his taunts. But in contrast to his cowering brethren, David looks around at them and says this in verse 26. Just remember how we've been introduced to him. This little brother, this errand boy, this shepherd. And now this guy speaks as boldly as this, verse 26. David said to the men who stood by him, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? 2 important firsts in verse 26. First of all, it is the first time David speaks. Not merely in this story, but in the entire Bible. These are the first recorded words of David. And number 2, it is the first time God's name gets mentioned in this chapter. To this point in the narrative, it has been completely godless. In all of Saul's hand-wringing about what to do about this Goliath problem, God's name doesn't come up once. It takes this errand boy to say what they should have been saying the first time Goliath opened his mouth, which is, are you really going to let this uncircumcised Philistine defy the armies of the living God? Like the faithless spies, all Saul can see is how big Goliath is. But now who is David channeling? The faithless spies? No, he's channeling Joshua and Caleb now. Like Joshua and Caleb, all David sees in Goliath is an uncircumcised Gentile standing on land God already promised to give Israel. See, the contrast between Saul's fear and David's boldness, this, I think, is really the main point of the chapter, or at least one of them. And the basic reason we need to see and just underline is faith. Faith is the reason. Saul sees the situation, he might as well be an atheist, really. He sees the situation as if he and Goliath are the only people involved in this battle. And if that's what you see when you see the situation, then if Goliath's bigger than I am, then I'm toast. And that's the calculation Saul's making. David is bold and courageous, not because he's any bigger than Saul, he's almost certainly smaller, but because he knows a man with God is always in the majority. When you're on God's side, the balance of power radically shifts. It's not a fair fight. Saul's right about that. He's just wrong in which direction it's not fair. It's not a fair fight when we're fighting on God's side. See, faithful people like David are more courageous and hopeful fundamentally. We have every reason in the world to be. It is faithless people like Saul who more often than not are fearful and fatalistic and running scared, which we should just probably pause and ask ourselves, who do we tend to act more like? We call ourselves children of God. If that's true, we have every reason in the world to go out in courage, to go out in boldness because of our underlying faith in the God we serve. That's what David does. And so we have the showdown between David and Saul. Victory, David. Next is a contrast between David and Eliab. Let's pick up in verse 28. Verse 28. Now Eliab, his oldest brother, David's oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men. And Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, "Why have you come down? And with whom have you left these few sheep, those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle." And David said, "What have I done now? Was it not but a word?" And he turned away from him towards another and spoke in the same way, and the people answered him again as before. Anyone here with siblings recognizes the dynamic here. Eliab is Jesse's oldest. He is David's oldest brother. We've met Eliab before, by the way. Back in the previous chapter, he's the one Samuel initially locked onto. This must be God's anointed, surely, when he saw Eliab. 1 Samuel 16 and verse 6, Samuel looked on Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed is before him." And so here's Eliab, the oldest, the impressive one. And then here comes baby brother who knows nothing about war. And he hears him talking this big game about Goliath. And he says derisively in these verses, "What are you doing here? You just came out of here out of some morbid curiosity, didn't you? You wanted to see what the big boys were up to. Don't you have some little sheep to look after? Who'd you leave looking after them? Don't you have something else to do?" To which David responds in verse 30, basically, "What have I done now? Can't I even talk?" And then he just sort of turns around and ignores his carping brother. But I think the conflict between David and Eliab goes deeper than just a little sibling squabble. I want us to notice the misplaced anger of Eliab. Verse 28, Eliab's anger was kindled against David. To which I want to say, Eliab, where is your anger against Goliath for blaspheming God? That's what David is outraged about in verse 26. But Eliab, you're angry at your brother for what? For mentioning God's name for the first time in the story? For mentioning God's honor? For being the first person to do something other than cower before Goliath? Is that what you're mad about? What exactly is it? Why are you angrier at David than you are Goliath? There's a question. Also notice this. Notice who Eliab sounds like in verse 28. Later in the chapter, when Goliath is face to face with David, and he is taunting him and expressing contempt for David in their showdown, this is in verse 42. What Goliath says in verse 42 expresses what Eliab has already said in verse 28. They practically say the same thing. You're just a little boy, go home to daddy. The point is, Eliab is Goliath in the story before Goliath. Goliath's words are in Eliab's mouth first. And Eliab is as much an obstacle to David as Goliath in this chapter. I'm beginning to see, we're just going along in the chapter here, verse by verse. The majority of the chapter is not about David and Goliath. It's about David and his faithless brethren. That's the greatest enemy in this chapter. Israel. Israel's what's wrong here. In verse 31, we return back to the showdown between David and Saul. Picks up again. So in verse 31, Saul catches wind of David's big talk. And this obviously has made an impression on him, and so he sends for him. In verse 32, David repeats his confidence to Saul, pledging to fight Goliath himself. And the cowardly Saul, he tries basically to pass on his faithless evaluation of the situation to David. Hey, he says, "Here, young boy, let me tell you a thing or two." Verse 33. Verse 33, Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth." But David's response really couldn't be less like Saul. David responds by making about 3 arguments for why Saul is wrong to doubt him. Better said, why Saul is wrong to doubt God. And each of these arguments David makes about why he should be able to fight him carries with it an implied critique of Saul and Saul's lack of faith. So the first argument David makes is this: you underestimate me. You underestimate me. Verse 34. But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his head and struck him and killed him." Now, where we live, it is considered a manly, very masculine activity to go hunting. by which we usually mean we get our rifle and we sit on a cushion in a deer stand and we wait around for a few hours and we pull a trigger. David would say, you call that hunting? You call that manly? He says, if a predator took one of my father's sheep, I would run it down with my staff, that was my weapon, and I would take the sheep out of its mouth, and if I had to, I would grab that predator and I would beat it to death. The point he's making to Saul is, I can handle myself. You underestimate me. The second argument he makes in verse 36 is that you lack indignation for God's honor. That's your problem. You lack indignation for God's honor. Verse 36. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. Don't you know what he has done? He repeats his outrage of verse 26, that this uncircumcised Philistine has been allowed to blaspheme God. By the way, notice this in the story. Not once in this chapter does David call him Goliath. Goliath's name never passes David's lips. In the mouth of David, he is always either this Philistine or this uncircumcised Philistine. Unlike Saul, and unlike Eliab or the rest of Israel's army, to David, the most important thing about Goliath is not his size, it's not his strength, it's not even his name. It doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is that he is not one of God's special covenant people. That's what he's pointing out each time. This Philistine, this uncircumcised Philistine, he is a Philistine who we should have driven out several generations ago, and it's high time we started acting like we believe God's promises. Did God promise us the land? Yes or no? Yes? Then let's drive him out. You lack indignation for God's honor. You lack faith in God's promises. And then in verse 37, his third argument is just this: you underestimate God. Verse 37, and David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And so now we really see his true thoughts on these stories about killing these predators. He attributes his victories over them to God. And then when this Philistine decided to bow up against God's people, like those animals tried to bow up against him, Goliath, he doesn't know it yet, but he's already consigned himself to that heap of lions and bears. Do you see the contrast between Saul's doubt in verse 33? Listen here, son. Let me tell you how things work in the military. He's been working at this longer than you've been alive. And then you have David in verse 37. Do you believe God or not? The contrast couldn't be any clearer. And by the way, don't miss the irony. The end of verse 37, don't miss the irony of Saul's answer to these arguments of David. The end of verse 37, he tells David, go, and the Lord be with you. Those are important telling words. In chapter 15, Saul disobeyed God in a big way, broke faith. And 1 Samuel 16 and verse 14 says, the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul. God is not with Saul anymore. And so in verse 37, when he blesses David, go, the Lord be with you, he is speaking truer words than he realizes. God was with David, and in a way he was not with Saul anymore. Now in the next few verses, while David is certain God will give him victory, he is not certain how the mechanics of this battle are going to be worked out. And so in verse 38, he's trying on Saul's armor. In verse 39, he quickly discovers that won't work. And I think what these scenes are really reinforcing is David's lack of military training, formal military training, and as well probably his smaller stature compared to Saul. Instead, David says, I'll use some weapons I'm a little more familiar with. I'll use my shepherd's staff and a sling. By the way, do not think of these as sort of improvised weapons, a little boy's slingshot, where he shoots a pebble at him. These are weapons used to great effect by shepherds, and even armies had battalions with people who slung stones like this. Could be very, very deadly. The point is, I know how to use these weapons, and I know how to use them well. Well, we come to verse 41, and we get to the showdown finally, after all of that. This story is most known for, the showdown between David and Goliath. Verse 41. And the Philistine moved forward and came near to David, with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field." When we were first introduced to Goliath in the beginning of the chapter, we were given this lengthy description of his size and his armor. We're actually not told anything at all about David's appearance in the whole Bible until the moment Goliath lays eyes on him in the battlefield in verse 42. The narrator allows Goliath to describe David for us. And what Goliath sees when he looks at David, what he says is, "This is what you send to me, a boy, a ruddy boy," which either means red-headed or red-cheeked. "A pretty boy, a handsome, this is what you send to me? This is what you challenge me with? You think I'm some sort of chump?" Again, Goliath sees the situation exactly like Saul, and exactly like Eliab, and exactly like the rest of Israel. To Goliath, this is a simple showdown between two warriors, and the bigger and stronger is going to win. But in verse 45, David reframes the whole showdown. He says, "You're looking at this all wrong," and he's telling the rest of Israel too, "You're looking at this all wrong." Verse 45. Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." See, this is what has occurred to no one else in the chapter. Not Saul, not Eliab, not any Israelite warrior. This is what no one else has realized. And that is that the gods Goliath curses David by in verse 43, curses him by the name of his gods. Those gods Goliath invokes don't exist. You know who does exist? Yahweh, Israel's God, David's God. Goliath thinks David's body will be food for the vultures because his weapons are better. But David says, no, it's your body that's going to be fed to the vultures because my God is realer. That changes things. The battle itself is really an afterthought. It takes all of 2 verses to describe. Verse 48. When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. Another thing the text really stresses is just how true David's statement in verse 47 was. In verse 47, he said, "The Lord saves not with sword or spear." The Lord saves not with sword. Verse 50 says, "There was no sword in the hand of David." The narrator is really at pains to stress, swords are not the means of victory here. David wields no sword in the story. Even in verse 51, the sword he uses to cut off Goliath's head is not his own sword, it's Goliath's sword. David wields no sword of his own. It is a sling and a stone guided by God that are responsible for the victory. As soon as Goliath is dead, the tables turn. The Philistines are now the ones running away in fear. By the way, the deal of verse 9 is quickly off. I guess that's the trick with agreeing our 2 greatest warriors will fight. The loser probably will renege on the deal whenever their guy dies. Meanwhile, Israel is emboldened to fight. They give chase to the Philistines who begin running away. I want us to think about this for a minute, though. What has really happened here? Like just in terms of logistics, of numbers. What has happened here is one Philistine has died. There are thousands of Philistines still there. How does the death of one Philistine change everything? Why should that turn the tables of an entire war? Now why are the Philistines running away and the Israelites giving chase? What has changed is that Israel saw a demonstration that Yahweh is the true God, and if you actually believe that like David, it changes everything. David was right, it turns out in verse 37, "The Lord will deliver me." It happened. What has changed is not a great numerical victory here. What has changed that instead of following a man who has no faith in God like Saul, which demoralizes them in verse 11, they follow his lead in being faithless and afraid and demoralized. Instead of following a man like that, they're now following a man with great faith which emboldens the rest of them to have that same faith. It's a wonderful story, well told, expertly told, full of many intricacies maybe we didn't pick up in children's Bible class. So for the next few minutes we have this evening, I want us to draw out 3 points for home that will bring this story off the page of Scripture and into our lives. The first being this: faithlessness begets fear and pride. God's name is not mentioned once in this story until David speaks up for the first time in verse 26. But no one else in the story is thinking about the God of Israel. And as a result, everyone in this story is full of either fear or pride. What I want us to see is that faithlessness begets both extremes. So the chapter opens with the Philistines sending Goliath out to challenge Israel. Verses 4 through 7 we have is his imposing size and his armor. And when he issues the challenge, he does so with defiance and proud confidence of someone who thinks he's invincible in verse 9. See, for the Philistines, this is a simple math. It's us against the Israelites, and we've got the bigger and badder warrior, and we're going to win. And so they trot out Goliath 40 days in a row to taunt Israel day after day after day. See, they don't believe in a God like Yahweh. They assume it's all about strength, and they assume because they're stronger, now they're proud. Do you see how when you don't believe in God, it leads to sort of pride in yourself? If it's just me and you, God's not a factor in this. I'm bigger, I'm proud. But at the other end of the valley are Saul and Israel. And part of the scandal of the story is that they're thinking about Yahweh about as much as the Philistines are. They are not thinking about the all-powerful God either. And so when they take in Goliath in verse 4, when they hear his taunts in verse 8, they're doing really the same simple math as the Philistines are. And the math is, he's bigger and he's badder than anyone we have, be afraid. And God doesn't enter the equation either. Verse 11 again, when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Israel is basically thinking like a bunch of Philistines. They, like the Philistines, assume it's all about strength. And because in their calculation they're weaker, they're not proud, they're something else, they're fearful. But do you see, Israel and Philistia have the exact opposite attitudes, but for the exact same reason. If you're not thinking about God, if He's not a factor in how you evaluate things, the only thing you go on is a simple math of who's bigger and who's stronger. You basically turn into a Darwinist. That only the strong will survive. And if you determine you're stronger, you're filled with pride. And if you determine you're weaker, you're filled with fear and anxiety. And I think what this should put us on alert for is when we detect in ourselves one of these two very different attitudes, either fear or pride, what has really happened here? If we really believe in a sovereign God who created everything, a God who has promised to right wrongs, to humble the exalted and exalt the humble, we would be kept from both errors. Because no one who really knows and trusts God will have the pride of Philistia. You can't. As if my strength or my money or my intellect makes me any less of a sinner in need of God's mercy. As if all of that I have adds anything to the power of God. Knowing God will keep you from pride better than anything. And no one who really knows and trusts God, will have this fear and despair of Israel either. As if the fact that I am weak, or I am poor, or I am any lesser than someone else means I'm doomed. It doesn't mean that. Not if God is with you. That's what David understands that no one else does. So the story really, I think, begs us to ask ourselves, if I am proud, or if I am afraid, what's the real reason here? Might it be really a deep spiritual problem? Might it be that I lack faith in God? Might it be that I'm evaluating the situation basically like an atheist for all intents and purposes? Faithlessness shoots us out, inevitably, in one of these two extremes, in either an extreme pride or extreme fear. Which brings us to number 2. The Lord sees not as man sees. As we open chapter 17 to find this detailed description of Goliath's imposing size, and as we find Israel cowering in his shadow, attentive readers should hear echoes of 2 other Old Testament passages. And we've mentioned one of them already. We've mentioned Israel's history of being afraid of Canaanite giants. That story of the faithless spies choosing to focus on how big the Canaanites are instead of how big God is. But because they lacked faith and trust in God, their view of things is warped. It's only Joshua and Caleb who see rightly. It's not that the Canaanites appeared to be any smaller to them. They rightly saw their size just like the others. They saw they were big. It was that they rightly saw things because they saw them from God's perspective. And so that story really is looming in the background, another story of Canaanite giants, judging things by appearances. But there is another passage hovering over 1 Samuel 17, and that is 1 Samuel 16. In chapter 15, God announced he had rejected Saul. In chapter 16, God instructs Samuel to travel to Bethlehem and to go to the house of Jesse to anoint a new king. And so Samuel arrives at Jesse's house, and he meets Eliab, who we've met in chapter 17 as well. And Eliab must have looked the part. It had helped as well, he's probably the first, that he is the firstborn. And so this is what Samuel thinks. It's recorded what Samuel thinks. In 1 Samuel 16 and verse 6, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. But God responds and corrects Samuel for not taking in the situation correctly. This is what God says in verse 7. Do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. So when we open chapter 17 to find this description of a giant, we should be thinking, wait a minute. I just learned about this. Don't look on the height of his stature. Isn't that what God just said? That doesn't mean anything how big he is. The Lord sees, not as man sees. The Lord looks on the heart. And what God sees when he looks at Goliath is not a big man. It's not a strong man. He sees a proud man, a godless man, an uncircumcised man, a Philistine standing on land God promised to Israel. See, the story of Goliath is simply another application of Numbers 13 and 1 Samuel 16 and verse 7. Here again are the same things. Here again is the temptation to judge things by external appearance. But it's time to remember, 1 Samuel 16 applies to Goliath as much as it did David. If we're not supposed to look at David and judge him by his appearance, if we're not supposed to see him like we want to see him, but as God sees him, we should also do the same thing with Goliath. The Lord sees not as man sees. By the way, that applies exactly as much today as it did then. If it applies to Goliath, if it applies to David, it applies to everyone on the face of the earth. God still sees today, not as man sees, but God looks at the heart. And until we start seeing things like God, we will not be thinking straight. The Lord sees not as man sees. Which brings us to number 3, third and finally. What matters is not whether you have the best weapons, but whether you have a real God. I think there's a lot to say in commendation of David in this chapter, and we have spoken well of him, rightly so. The courage of David, the bravery of David, maybe even the good aim of David. But the real focus of the chapter really isn't the courage of David or the faith of David. David himself keeps telling us in this chapter that this is not about him, this is not about his weapons, this is not about his skill or his power. It is all about the God he trusts. David himself says as much. He says to Saul in verse 37, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion, from the paw of the bear, will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. The Lord was the one who did it with those predators, and the Lord is the one who will do it now. In verse 46, he says to Goliath, this day the Lord will deliver you into my hand. This victory isn't mine, it is God's. And then to reinforce this point, that it's not about David's weapons, it's not about David's strength that delivers him, but God's, the text makes very clear David has no sword of his own in verse 50. In verse 47 again, the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. It's not about having superior weapons, he says. It's about having a real God. By the way, this idea is repeated over and over and over again in the Psalms. You can't escape it. Psalm 20 and verse 7, some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. Psalm 33, the king is not saved by his great army. A warrior is not delivered by his great strength. The war horse is a false hope for salvation, and by its might it cannot rescue. Behold, the eye of the Lord is on those who fear him, and those who hope on his steadfast love, that he may deliver their soul from death and keep them alive from famine. Psalm 147, God's delight is not in the strength of the horse, nor his pleasure in the legs of a man, but the Lord takes pleasure in those who fear him, and those who hope in his steadfast love. What the story of David and Goliath teaches us is that what makes us really safe and secure, what allows us to sleep soundly at night and to hold our heads high in the day, has nothing to do with how big and bad we are. It has nothing to do with how financially secure we are. It has nothing to do with how militarily strong our nation might be. It has nothing to do with that. What makes us secure today and for eternity is knowing and serving the one true and living God. David wins in this story, not because he has the best weapons, but because he's the only one that serves the real God. Everything else is beside the point. I think maybe instead of calling this story David versus Goliath, I think David versus Saul would be a better title. But I think if we could ask David what we should call this story, he would tell us to call it this. Call it God versus Goliath. What David demonstrates in this story is that to really know and trust God is to rise above both pride and fear, both of which come from faithlessness. What David would tell us is to evaluate every situation from God's point of view, to see things as the Lord sees. What David would tell us is to derive our confidence from nothing but our relationship with God. Everything else is beside the point. Now, I don't know about you, but this story, jumping into it with both feet like we've done this evening, is an enormous critique and challenge to my own faith. It calls me to ask myself, why am I so afraid? How am I evaluating my world and my life, this world and my life? What do I really trust? Those are some really grown-up questions to come out of this children's story. And so I suppose we should end by asking, do you finally need to put your trust in God? Sorry about that. Do you finally need to put your trust in God? David is our model here. David is our model. You'll be safe, you'll be delivered because of one thing and one thing only. You serve and trust the one true and living God. Is there someone here this evening that needs to come and put their trust in him? Maybe that's in the initial step of faith, the one where we totally submit ourselves to our Lord, the one where we confess him as such, repent of our sins, and then get into the waters of baptism to have those washed away. Or maybe there's someone here who needs to repent of this sort of faithlessness of Saul, the faithlessness of Israel, that has not been looking at God rightly. If there's anyone that has any sort of spiritual need, come forward now.